Pope Francis passed away at the age of 88 after prolonged illness. He breathed his last at his residence in the Vatican's Casa Santa Marta.
They said the Vatican was the most secure place on earth. They said nothing gets out unless it's meant to. But now after the death of Pope Francis, something has slipped through, and slowly but surely it's sending shock waves across the globe. What was found in the Pope's private quarters isn't just unusual. It's the kind of thing that forces people to ask, what else don't we know? This is real, confirmed. And by the end of this video you'll understand why what they found has left even the Vatican speechless. The final days. Pope Francis's final days were marked by quiet resilience, deep faith, and a calm acceptance of the end. The world watched as the 88-year-old pontiff, known for his humility and reformist spirit, entered what would be the last chapter of his papacy and life. While many expected his health to be a lingering concern, few were prepared for how quickly events would unfold in the early months of 2025. The first major sign of trouble came in February. Pope Francis was admitted to JLI Hospital in Rome, the same medical facility where he had received treatment for earlier ailments including colon surgery in 2021 and bronchitis in 2023. This time the diagnosis was pneumonia. Vatican sources confirmed that the illness was more serious than previous health scares. The Pope had been experiencing labored breathing and severe fatigue before his admission. Over the next 38 days he remained under close observation at the hospital. He underwent a series of tests and was treated with a combination of antibiotics and supportive care. Reports from the Vatican press office described his condition as stable but required constant monitoring. His absence from the Vatican became a matter of international interest. Each medical bulletin was dissected by the global press and the Catholic faithful alike, trying to gauge the severity of his condition. Despite the gravity of the illness, Francis remained mentally active. He continued to receive visitors including close aides and cardinals, and even participated in several brief video calls. His personal secretary Bishop Fabio Salerno noted that the Pope often requested readings from Scripture and updates on global humanitarian crises, especially conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine. It was evident that even as his body weakened, his spirit remained engaged. After nearly 6 weeks, Pope Francis was released from Gemelli Hospital and returned to the Vatican. Frail but determined, he resumed limited duties from the Casa Santa Marta, the modest guest house he had chosen over the traditional papal apartments. His first public appearance after returning came during Palm Sunday Mass at St. Peter's Square. Though visibly weakened and reliant on a wheelchair, he waved to crowds and offered brief blessings. Then came Easter Sunday. On April 20, 2025, Pope Francis delivered his final Urbi et Orbi blessing, a message to the city and to the world. Delivered from the central loggia of St. Peter's Basilica, it was notably shorter than usual. His voice was low and breathy, and at moments he seemed to struggle to maintain the rhythm of his address. But the message was unmistakable, one of peace, unity, and mercy. What struck many was not only the content of his message but his presence. Cameras captured his struggle to ascend to the platform, assisted closely by aides and the Swiss Guard. But when he raised his hand for the blessing, it was a firm final show of strength from a man whose life had been defined by compassion for the vulnerable. Little did anyone know that this man would hide something in his quarters, something that will leave you speechless. The end came quietly and without warning on the morning of April 21, 2025. According to official Vatican statements, Pope Francis awoke at his usual early hour but collapsed shortly thereafter. Medical personnel arrived swiftly but could not revive him. The cause was determined to be a cerebral stroke followed by irreversible cardiocirculatory collapse. He died at 7:35 a.m. There was no panic, no chaos, just an eerie silence at Casa Santa Marta. A priest was summoned to administer the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. Several of his closest aides and spiritual advisors were present, including his longtime personal nurse Massimiliano Stretti. He was the one to whom Pope Francis whispered his final words, Grazie Paluzza, meaning thank you for the last ride. These words, later confirmed by both Vatican News, referred to a quiet moment several days earlier when Massimiliano had arranged a private ride for the Pope in the Pope Mobile, his last trip through the Vatican gardens. He had asked for it specifically, saying he wanted to feel the wind one more time. That gratitude, simple and deeply personal, was his final farewell. News of his passing broke within the hour and spread worldwide. By noon, thousands had gathered at St. Peter's Square. Some prayed, some wept, others simply stood in silence. Vatican officials began preparing for a state funeral but also opened the doors of the basilica almost immediately, allowing the faithful to pay their respects. By the end of the day, over 20,000 people had passed through St. Peter's Basilica. The Pope lay in state in an open casket, dressed in simple white liturgical garments, a wooden rosary in his hands. His face, pale but serene, bore no sign of pain. It was, as many noted, the expression of a man who had made peace with his fate. World leaders and religious figures sent messages of condolence. Former U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, Italian President Sergio Mattarella, and UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres each called his death a loss not just for the Church but for humanity. Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople called him a brother in Christ, and the Dalai Lama praised his deep compassion for the suffering. The final days of Pope Francis were just another reminder of his core philosophy: humility, service, and mercy. Even in sickness, he refused to retreat into luxury. Even in death, he remained present to those around him, right down to thanking a nurse for a small gesture of kindness. And perhaps that is why his passing struck such a deep chord across cultures and continents. Pope Francis did not die as a distant religious leader. He died as a man of the people, frail, grateful, and fully human. The Vatican had yet to release full details of what would follow: the conclave, the burial, and the possible revelations from his private quarters. But for now, the world was united in mourning. A life had ended. A chapter had closed. And the silence he left behind was filled with awe. The Vatican under lockdown. The passing of Pope Francis sent ripples across the world. But behind the solemn images of mourning crowds and candlelit vigils at St. Peter's Square, a very different reality was unfolding inside the Vatican's walls. In the hours after his passing, the Holy See moved into an unprecedented state of lockdown, not just to protect the sanctity of the papal succession, but to shield something else. Something was found in the Pope's quarters that, as insiders suggest, warranted extreme containment. Sources familiar with Vatican operations confirmed that key buildings including the Apostolic Palace, Casa Santa Marta, and the Domus Sancti Marthi were immediately swept for electronic vulnerabilities. Signal jammers were activated, cutting off mobile phone access, Wi-Fi, and satellite communications in and around the Sistine Chapel and papal apartments. This was not just to preserve the confidentiality of the coming conclave, but because something in the Pope's quarters had triggered a response far more urgent than usual protocol. These jammers were military-grade, the same kind used during counter-espionage operations. Wired magazine reported that the Vatican's technology team, in cooperation with external cybersecurity experts, had rolled out a multi-layered defense system. Surveillance cameras equipped with facial recognition, motion tracking, and encrypted feeds were already in place but were now operating in constant high-alert mode. Privacy films were applied to the windows of all buildings where sensitive operations or examinations were underway. Even drones were used to monitor the airspace. And let's face it, for centuries, the Vatican's greatest defense had been secrecy. But nowadays, secrecy demands sophisticated tools. The transformation of the Vatican into what Wired aptly called an electronic bunker wasn't entirely new. The groundwork was laid during the 2013 papal conclave, after the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, when concerns about leaks and surveillance first took root. But what followed Pope Francis's final hours was more extreme than ever before. Faraday cages, rooms shielded from electromagnetic signals, were reportedly activated inside key administrative buildings. Vatican officials used analog communication methods, handwritten notes, sealed letters, and in-person briefings. No digital record was allowed for any discussion related to the Pope's personal quarters or the unexpected items discovered there. Fingerprint and retinal scanners were temporarily installed at entry points to restricted areas. Only a handful of top-level officials, including members of the Apostolic Camera and the Secretary of State, were granted full access. All of this was overseen by the Vatican's internal intelligence unit, known informally as La Sala, a small but powerful group responsible for counterintelligence and digital surveillance within the church's walls. And while technology created barriers, it was the Swiss Guard and the Vatican Gendarmerie who ensured those barriers were not breached. The Swiss Guard, typically seen in ceremonial armor and Renaissance uniforms, was now rotated with tactical units. Units trained in modern defense protocols. These elite guards drawn from Switzerland's top military schools were deployed around high-security zones including Casa Santa Marta, the Pope's quarters, and the site of the mystery at the heart of the lockdown. Meanwhile, the Vatican Gendarmerie, the Vatican's police force, played an equally critical role. Their scope expanded overnight. They were tasked not only with protecting personnel and infrastructure but also with assisting in the inventory and documentation of the Pope's private effects. All members involved were required to sign binding confidentiality agreements. Phones were confiscated. Personal bags were inspected. For hours, everyone inside the Vatican had restricted communication with the outside world. There was a reason for this level of enforcement. And it wasn't just the looming conclave. Historically, these security measures exist to shield the selection process of a new pope from interference or influence. But there was a growing sense that something else had prompted the Vatican's quick descent into secrecy. High-ranking sources hinted that Vatican officials had found several unexpected items in Pope Francis's quarters. The contents were not disclosed publicly at first, but they were described as sensitive enough to affect church diplomacy and potentially destabilizing if misunderstood. This was unusual. Most popes leave behind writings, books, perhaps a few personal artifacts. But this was different. The fact that security protocols escalated before any conclave logistics had even begun suggested that the priority wasn't just preventing leaks about the next pope. It was controlling information related to the current one. Rumors began to swirl. Were these political documents, a secret letter, financial records, something else entirely? Whatever the case, it was clear that access to Pope Francis's personal rooms was restricted not just to clergy but to a forensic team that had the job to catalog belongings and assess implications. But why this way? For much of his time as pontiff, Pope Francis had advocated for transparency. He pushed for financial reforms, opened the Vatican's archives on sensitive periods of church history, and often warned against the spirit of secrecy. Yet he wasn't entirely out of controversies. As his health declined and his time drew short, he became more vocal, more urgent. He made choices and statements that surprised many and unsettled some within the church and beyond. These were not political gestures. They were reflections of his deeply held belief that compassion must be at the center of faith. A message to the powerful. One of Pope Francis's final global messages came during a public audience just weeks before his passing. Without singling anyone out but exactly at the right time to signal it, some people, the Pope addressed what he saw as a growing trend of isolationism and exclusion around the world. He reminded his listeners that Christian love has no passport and that to truly live the gospel meant seeing every human being as a neighbor, not just those who share our country, language, or faith. This wasn't a political counterpoint. It was a pastoral one. Pope Francis often warned against any worldview that reduced faith to a cultural identity. In his words, fraternity is not an optional extra for Christians. It is a command. His message was clear: borders may define nations, but they must not define mercy. Another point of contention came from Pope Francis's repeated condemnation of the global arms trade. In a series of homilies and written reflections, he spoke out against the economic structures that profit from conflict. Those who manufacture and sell weapons fuel war, he said during a Holy Week address. They cannot claim to follow the Prince of Peace. These were strong words, and they unsettled more than a few in positions of power. Yet he didn't focus on any single country or conflict. His concern was broader, that human lives were being reduced to collateral in business models. That the poor, often women and children, paid the highest price for decisions made far from the battlefield. This critique wasn't new for Francis, but in his final months, it became more pointed, more frequent. He knew he was running out of time, and he was determined not to leave quietly. And there was more. As Rome prepared for the 2025 Jubilee year, Francis turned his attention to an uncomfortable truth. While the city geared up for spiritual festivities, many of its own residents were sleeping on the streets. In a homily delivered just weeks before his passing, Pope Francis called on the Catholic Church in Rome to respond not just with charity but with resources. He urged bishops, religious orders, and Catholic institutions to open vacant church-owned properties to the homeless, not someday, but now. He believed the Church should lead not only in prayer but in sacrifice, and he practiced what he preached, having himself chosen to live in a modest guest house instead of the lavish apostolic palace. He never set out to be a controversial figure. He didn't seek attention, nor did he frame his actions in opposition to anyone. His compass was always the same: the gospel, especially its call to serve the least among us. If some of his decisions sparked discomfort, it was because he asked people, including the Church itself, to change. And real change is always uncomfortable. Now, with the Vatican under lockdown and his personal quarters sealed, questions linger. Could his most private writings contain more of this unfiltered urgency? Did he leave behind plans or messages meant to challenge the Church even after his death? In the end, he did push for reforms. The Jubilee year. The 2025 Jubilee year was meant to be a celebration of grace and renewal. For Pope Francis, it became something more, a culmination of everything he stood for. Hope in the face of suffering, inclusion in the face of exclusion, and reform in the face of resistance. In what would be his final public acts as leader of the Catholic Church, he crafted a jubilee that was less about grandeur and more about mercy, less about ritual and more about the people. This was not a jubilee for tradition's sake. It was his legacy. The year officially began with the opening of the Holy Door at St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas Eve 2024. As is tradition, the massive bronze doors were opened to symbolize a passage into spiritual renewal. With millions expected to make pilgrimages to Rome in 2025, it was a moment rich in ritual. But for Pope Francis, it was also personal. He appeared visibly frail at the ceremony, leaning heavily on aids but still determined to carry out the rite himself. Just days later, he made a decision that stunned even those within the Vatican. He opened a second holy door not at another basilica but inside Rabbia prison on the outskirts of Rome. This was unprecedented. Standing before a crowd of inmates, he reminded them that the door of God's mercy is never locked. The symbolism was powerful. He hugged inmates. He shared meals with them. He listened to their stories. And he reminded the world that no one is outside the reach of mercy. Throughout the Jubilee year, the Pope returned again and again to the themes outlined in his 2020 encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Italian for all brothers. In it, Francis argued that the world's divisions, whether rooted in politics, economics, or ideology, must be bridged through compassion and dialogue. This was the philosophical backbone of the 2025 Jubilee. In his speeches and writings throughout the year, Francis emphasized that true holiness was found not in isolation or purity but in relationship with the poor, the outcast, the stranger. No one is saved alone. He repeated often, "We are either brothers and sisters or we are nothing." Events planned for the Jubilee reflected this ethos. Instead of lavish liturgies, the Vatican supported grassroots initiatives, community dinners for the homeless, interfaith dialogues, refugee support centers, and medical clinics. Every pilgrim who came to Rome was encouraged not just to visit the basilicas but to serve. Francis insisted that a holy year could not be divorced from real-world suffering. It had to mean something for the single mother, the common worker, the elderly widow. And so it did. One of his clearest priorities was increasing the role of women in church governance. Though he did not open the priesthood to women, he appointed them to high-ranking positions previously reserved for men, including lay women overseeing departments at the Vatican Curia. For Francis, this was not a mere symbolic gesture. It was a step towards structural change. But he was well known for this goal. During the 2023 Synod on Synodality, he approved voting rights for non-ordained individuals, a first in church history. He emphasized that the Holy Spirit does not speak only through clerics but through the whole people of God. Critics called the reforms too slow. Traditionalists worried they were too fast. But Francis moved with the certainty of someone who believed the Church must evolve or risk irrelevance. And even as he championed change, Francis stayed consistent in his defense of life from conception to natural death. In his first homily of 2025, he addressed topics that often divide the Church. Rather than condemn, he sought to appeal to conscience. Life is not an object, he said, it is a mystery to be protected. He acknowledged the complexity of these issues but made his stance clear: society must offer alternatives rooted in dignity, not convenience. He urged governments to provide better care for expectant mothers, the elderly, and those with terminal illnesses, not just legal restrictions but real support systems. He also highlighted the Church's role in that effort. He directed dioceses around the world to fund hospices and maternal clinics and to train priests and lay workers in bioethics and pastoral care. Francis's vision was all about affirming life always, especially when it was most vulnerable, and that's exactly what made the 2025 Jubilee different: the emotional clarity. It should have been a year of personal testimony from a pope who knew his time was short and used it to plant seeds of mercy. Humility encouraged the final act. He didn't try to fix everything. He didn't pretend the Church was without fault. He gave it a direction outward, toward the world, toward the forgotten, toward the future. But even in his death he managed to do something no one could have predicted. Just listen to this, because what they found in Pope Francis's quarters will leave you speechless. According to sources within the Vatican close to Theostuous' inventory process, a sealed envelope was discovered inside the Pope's personal desk drawer. It was marked only with the words "Confid" and the papal seal. Multiple sources have confirmed that the envelope contained handwritten pages, not an official testament or church document, but what has been described as a spiritual memorandum addressed to the future of the Church. It reportedly outlined Pope Francis's unfiltered thoughts on internal corruption, geopolitical manipulation within church diplomacy, and what he believed were existential threats to Catholic credibility in the modern age. But the most startling detail, according to a former Vatican communications official, the document named specific individuals, including high-ranking clergy, and accused them of obstructing transparency, mismanaging Vatican funds, and silencing victims. It is unclear whether these allegations were ever formally investigated during Francis's lifetime, but reports suggest that the presence of such a document has halted several transitions in the Vatican's administration of the upcoming conclave. Tucker Carlson, who was recently granted rare access to a senior Vatican official, hinted in a special segment that what the Pope left behind is far more dangerous than any doctrinal debate. This is shocking, he teased, claiming the document included references to foreign influence and a covert campaign to derail the Church's reform agenda. The Vatican, as it often does, refused to comment publicly, but behind closed doors, investigators and cardinals are reportedly divided not just over the contents of the letter but over whether to release it at all. What Pope Francis could have taken to his grave may now confront the Church with the one thing it's tried hardest to avoid: the truth written in his own hand. The story of Pope Francis's final days is not just one of physical decline or ecclesiastical transition, but a profound narrative of conviction, humility, and mystery. At the age of 88, the man-born Jorge Mario Bergoglio left behind not only a spiritual legacy that touched billions but also a trail of unanswered questions and unprecedented events that shook even the fortified walls of the Vatican. His passing was quiet, almost humble, much like the way he lived, but its aftermath has been anything but. In the days following his death, the world witnessed an institution historically known for secrecy descending into a level of security and containment that sparked global speculation. What was discovered in the Pope's private quarters remains undisclosed, yet the mere suggestion of its gravity reveals how deeply his influence, and perhaps his truth, ran. Throughout his papacy, Pope Francis championed the voiceless. He chose simplicity over splendor, advocacy over appeasement, and action over symbolism. In his final weeks, even as his body weakened from pneumonia and ultimately succumbed to a cerebral stroke, his heart remained tethered to causes greater than himself. From condemning the arms trade to calling for church properties to house the homeless, he was relentless in his pastoral mission. His final public gestures, celebrating Mass from a wheelchair, delivering a frail but potent Easter message, and opening a holy door in a prison, were both symbolic and revolutionary. They echoed his lifetime belief that God's grace is for all, especially the marginalized. And yet, in the shadows of this clarity and compassion, lies a deeper tension. the extraordinary lockdown of the Vatican and the forensic cataloging of his belongings indicate that Francis may have left behind more than spiritual writings. Perhaps there are revelations that challenge the status quo, messages meant to be read after his death, or documentation of truths that threaten to disrupt the delicate balance of faith and politics within the Church. If so, these revelations may not tarnish his legacy, but rather affirm it, showing that even in death, Francis continued to push the Church toward honesty, transparency, and reform. The 2025 Jubilee year, envisioned by Pope Francis as a spiritual renaissance for the modern era, became his final opus, a culmination of his teachings and his character. It invited not just ritual, but reflection. Not just pilgrimage, but purpose. His message was simple yet radical: we are either brothers and sisters, or we are nothing. That sentiment, carried now by a church in mourning and transformation, is both a challenge and a charge. Pope Francis died not just as the head of the Catholic Church, but as a shepherd who never stopped walking with his flock. His final act was not his death, but the legacy he left behind, a living call to mercy, justice, and courage. The world may never fully know what was found in his quarters, but what he gave in life was already enough to change hearts. In his absence, the silence he leaves behind speaks louder than words, a silence filled with truth, waiting to be heard.